Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.
So, good afternoon and welcome. My name is Kirsten Wylie, and I'm here today to introduce and welcome Dr. Stuart Brown, who is visiting us today as part of the Microsoft Research Visiting Speaker Series. Dr. Brown is here today to discuss play, how it shapes the brain, opens the imagination, and invigorates the soul. This book introduces us to the importance of play in the lives of animals and humans, its role in developing social and locomotive skills in children, and creative thinking in later life. In a world obsessed with hard work, play is fun, natural, and necessary. It is a fundamental process. Dr. Brown builds a compelling case for the importance of recreation to success and creativity and insists that grown-ups need it too. Dr. Brown is a medical doctor, a scientific researcher, and founding clinical director at Mercy Hospital and Medical Center, as well as an associate professor at UC San Diego prior to founding the National Institute for Play. Dr. Brown was the executive producer of the three-part PBS series, The Promise of Play, and his research in this field has been profiled in cover stories from National Geographic to the New York Times. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Stuart Brown to Microsoft. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, it's nice to be the biggest here and the biggest playground in Washington State, I hope. What I'm going to try and do today is give you first a flyby of play, kind of its natural history, and hopefully have you all fantasize during the period of talking about your own best play moments so that when we get into a Q&A afterward, we can enrich each other's lives. But the image on the screen is the mantra of the National Institute for Play, which exists to really bring evidence-based information into public knowledge and public practice about play because there are many, many misconceptions about it. And you've seen the cover of the book, and I see that there's a stack back there which will allow me to retire early if you buy all of that stack out. So I happen to look at play as something that is a biological force and something everybody really needs to understand more fully. If you take a look at this 15th century courtyard in Eastern Europe that Bruegel painted, you can count 121 different people and 74 different kinds of play, which was ostensibly a norm in that community at that time. There are a few of us who think we may have lost a little something of that in our own communities in our current period. And this was a New York Times magazine that came out February of last year, and the reason I put it up there is, yes, it's wonderful. They're emphasizing play and it's important as an evolutionary process, but if you'll notice, there's not one adult that's sitting there in those play scenes at all. And yet the natural history of play is that it belongs to us through our entire life cycle.
It's an evolutionary strategy, a way young animals learn to be adults. It can occupy most of childhood's waking hours. And it may turn out that success in life depends on it. But one thing about it is obvious. It's fun. It doesn't really matter if you're a kitten or a kid or a kangaroo. The urge to play is built into your genes. And that's why we know it's important. to be young again, to romp, to frolic, to cavort, to play tug of war and leapfrog and king of the hill. This curious behavior is almost universal among young, warm-blooded animals. The question is, why? Why all this apparently useless horsing around?
And next, I'd like to take you through a sequence that's become reasonably familiar since somebody swiped it and put it on YouTube. But this is a wild male polar bear north of Churchill, Manitoba, headed for a tethered sled dog, a female sled dog that's tethered. Picture taken by a German photographer who was doing a story for a German magazine on the sled dogs. And when this bear began to approach the sled dog, the trapper who owns them and the photographer were absolutely certain that this sled dog was going to be lunch for the polar bear. But if you look a little more closely at what's going on, those ears are flat, the hair is flat, there are no fangs showing, no fangs here. And in a video of this, the dog had just been in a play bow, signaling it's time to get started with some play, which is exactly what they did for about a 20-minute period. And one of the things that's striking, I think, about this is that in the exchange of play signals and the agreement by both of them to play, they do a couple of things that's intrinsic to play. They are exploring the possible between a highly asymmetric power group. We don't do that very often in our culture. They also, if you will look at the state of being that both the bear and the dog are, there is a hugely carnivorous bear with his fangs on the throat of the sled dog, willingly. So another thing that goes on in play in the natural history is an essential trust and the signaling between two that what follows in this ritual will not harm you. Fundamental element of play. This should be everybody's Christmas card as far as I'm concerned. It really shows some of the power of play, and as they left each other, the bear went back to his lair, came back the next night, and for 2 weeks, before the ice came into Hudson Bay, they engaged in this kind of play nightly. And then the ice came in, and the bear went out and started to kill and munch on seals. But while the play signals were going, it was a really marvelous ballet. The exploration of the possible. Now, one of the ways that I've come to look at play is, and that's been supported by the basic neuroscience that's both operative in deep understanding of animal play and other animal states, and to a limited degree in us, is that these are these basic states of being that are embedded really deeply into our nervous system: care and dependency, sleep and dreaming, and surprisingly play. We're not surprised about fear and panic, seeking, anger, rage, lust, but these are fundamental states of being, and most of us don't think of play as being a fundamental state of being. We think of it as something that's elective that should be done when everything else is taken care of. And the context that I want to try and frame play is an evolutionary context. One of my senior scientists at UCSD got this slide together, and I thought it was extremely accurate, depicting exactly the way we've got to where we are. And here's another picture of a true picture of our central nervous system. Don't let these people who talk about the corpus callosum and the parietal lobe fool you. That's what it is. And this is our oldest relative. This is a sea squirt. Right there is a sea squirt larval brain. 600 ganglia that tell that sea squirt larva to what is toxic and what is pleasurable, and allow it to navigate itself through time and space. This is a basic function of all brain function for all of us. It tells us what's toxic, and it guides us through time and space. And there's an interesting thing about the sea squirt in that it operates by the same principle that all nervous systems do. When it becomes an adult, it attaches itself to a rock. And at this point, it becomes a senior manager of Microsoft, and it auto-digests its brain because it's sessile. It actually happens. So part of the mantra about play and part of what occurs throughout life is use it or lose it. This is a koala. Oh, isn't that a cute koala? We all think of the koala as being, a cute teddy bear from Australia. The koala has a cranium this big and has a brain that's about this big, because the koala no longer has to forage for food. It gets automatic food from eucalyptus leaves, and it's got a bunch of friendly bacteria that digest them. So the koala can lie up in a tree and be pretty lazy, and in the course of evolution has lost a great deal of its brain substance. And the same thing has occurred in this picture, this brain imaging that I was able to do on Homer Simpson, which shows that a couch potato really loses it if you don't move. I moved to this one because this is the grounding base of play behavior, the attachment process between parent and child, between mother and infant. And if you'll notice these two as they stare at each other, something that's hardwired and fairly magical happens. If the baby is old enough to engage in a radiant smile, which this one is on the screen, when that smile erupts, the mother responds with joyfulness, assuming she's safe, well-fed, not too harassed, so on. And the baby begins to become more radiant. The mother then starts to do baby talk, and baby's making clowning, stupid sounds. And if we wired these people up, as we've done in the National Institute for Play has a project going in Chicago, where we're doing mobile EEG during these states of early attachment, which is called attunement, we'll find that the central nervous system, particularly the right cerebral cortex of both the baby and the mother, get in synchrony and form a harmonic attunement. And with that harmonic attunement is the eruption of joyfulness, which is the grounding base of play behavior. And if you think about play behavior starting in this way as social play, and that the other forms of play that I will be showing you build on this emotional, special state of being, I think you'll understand play in your own life and part of why it's so necessary for us. So now I'm going to give you just a kind of a taxonomy of play. There's body play, which is also a marvelous, joyful experience that every kid, and I hope all of us, can have every day of our lives. It's certainly seen in the animal world, and the desire to leave gravity and to leap upward seems to be one of the fundamental aspects of play. I've got a couple of friends in the back, my son and a man by the name of Frank Forensic, who like to, challenge gravity by doing a bunch of rock and mountain climbing, which I suspect comes from some of this same kind of play urge. This is a picture I took in the Serengeti of a young hippo. You'll see that hippo in the foreground engaging in a backflip. Now, you show this to a biologist and you'll try to say, now, are they trying to get, bacteria off their back? No, this is done for its own sake, which is one of the definitions of play behavior, and as are most others. This, again, is body play, where we'll hope that those leaves are soft enough to keep him from the orthopedist. Pendulum-like swinging this orang in the wild. The point of this is that body play is a fundamental aspect of playfulness. It heightens your spirits. If you're having a really bad day and you're not a natural player, get out and move your body, and you'll find, as Bob Fagan, a bear researcher friend of mine, says, I've found play fills an empty heart. So we see parallels, of course, between animal and human play. And one of the things about play is that it involves risk-taking. And it's really clear that boundaries need to be set, and parenting boundaries need to be set, unless that kid can really launch himself out into the water. So that though play does increase the risk of death and damage, and though it's been retained more and more evolutionarily, the smarter the animal, it doesn't mean that all free play is wonderful and you should just let your kids go anywhere you want, because at that age that kid's got to be he's got to be restrained. Another shot of body play. I can't help, I worked with the National Geographic for a while, and when you do, you get to see their photographs, and this is one of my favorites of a dolphin at sunset. And then there's object play. Fundamental aspect of play, manipulating objects, messing around with what's in your field of vision. Here's a Japanese macaque making a snowball. Jane Goodall's chimp beginning to form the rudiments of a termite finding tool, playing with objects. Tremendously important element of human brain coevolution is hand-brain coevolution. And I could, if you read the book, you'll find that I've got a part of the book in there about how the R&D people at JPL and to some degree at Boeing are now only hiring people, despite Caltech PhDs and Harvard summa cum laude to their background, they're only hiring those who they find were tinkerers early in their life, because tinkerers are better problem solvers. Not just problem solvers with objects, but problem solvers metaphorically and with other kinds of imaginative activity. Pretty universal that toys and play are part of play behavior. And I'm not sure. I think this is play, but it brings up some points that may come up in the Q&A about what constitutes the most healthy forms of play that we can engage in. And this is an example that hand-brain coevolution continues right through our life cycle, where quilting and use of hands brings a certain type of joy, particularly to people who are so endowed. And there's exploratory play. This leopard cub doesn't know exactly what to make of that tortoise. And so during exploration, until the object or until the area of exploration is known to be safe, play doesn't exist. But as soon as the leopard decided that that tortoise was not a threat, up in the air went the tortoise, and of course it was not play for the tortoise. But that's exploratory play, as is this anatomic exploratory play done, in nature by this young man to his somewhat probably surprised mother as she turned around. Then a huge area of play that we all engage in, and part of what we're doing here today, I hope, is social play. And there's a normal developmental sequencing worldwide in what we see in social play when it is allowed to emerge. Initially, kids engage in parallel play. They aren't really all that attached to each other. Their parents think they're attached to each other, but the kids are basically a little more comfortable doing their own thing with each other, and that is the rudiment of social play. And if you can extrapolate some of what I'm going to be saying about social play to yourself or your own situation, if you're finding you're in a new set of circumstances and trying not to be the new kid on the block, or you're feeling a little left out, parallel play and some of the involvement of mutually helpful play, which involves some sharing, is a part of the natural sequencing of social play behavior. And one of the outcomes, of course, of social play is a sense of belonging. And this is where we get in our developmental life the rudiments of community. And there have been a lot of longitudinal studies, one done particularly by an investigator by the name of Brian Sutton Smith, who has followed longitudinally kids since shortly after World War II to the present time, and has found that those who were involved in communal kinds of play as kids tend to be community-capable adults. And those who have missed out on this, or who have not engaged as much in early rough and tumble and early kinds of play states, find more difficulty in meshing well in complex group situations in which there's always some controversy and some difficulty. So belonging is an important part of social play. And I'll get into a little more of social play later, but just to give you kind of the taxonomy of play, one of the things that kids do, and as I was talking with Kirsten right before the talk, imaginative and pretend play is really an important part of the developmental sequencing of play. And being a psychiatrist and having listened to lots of adults in their travail and trying to analyze what's going on in their travail and then listening to my own internal narratives, I find that my patients, myself, and most everybody I know, even though they're not kids, still have a running narrative with a lot of imagination and pretend. What are you going to do the next hour? You don't really know, but you usually think about what you're going to be doing, or the next vacation, or this or that, or how you get along with your spouse when you get home. So we really continue to build on pretend and imagination, and the richness of that has a huge amount to do with how flexible and how adaptable and how innovative we become. He's everybody. He's Superman. He's an aquanaut. Wonderful picture. Now, my son in the back will recognize this picture because that's his younger sister about 35 years ago. Well, she and I were walking through a place in Torrey Pines Park in San Diego called Fat Man's Misery, a narrow sandstone wash. She stopped and began to engage in a kind of a pretend and imaginative play. I just find this touching, so I can't keep from showing off my daughter, who probably is, with her own kids, doing the same thing now. An important part of play, rough and tumble play. Here, there are a couple of pictures that if I had to just stick to having one or two, which probably might be merciful to the audience, I would stay with this one in part, because look what's going on here in these two young lionesses in their rough and tumble play. Notice that this is a curvilinear, relaxed vertebral column, that there are no claws, that there is, if I saw this happening in the wild and from a distance it looked like a fight. It was rat-a-tat-tat-tat-tat-tat-tat, but the sounds that were coming out were totally different than the sounds of a fight. They were joyful kind of cat sounds. No fangs like the polar bear and the sled dog. They are learning their terrain. They're learning their own skills. They're involved in socialization that is very complex. And from animal experts that I have spoken with about this age group, this is the period of maximal brain development in young lionesses. So they're fertilizing and sculpting what's going on in their brains through this kind of behavior. And in a little while I'll get to talking about some murderers that I've studied who were play deprived. They were play deprived in rough and tumble play. So this is an extremely important natural type of play that is not generally appreciated by most of us adults in the culture, because if we go into a preschool and you see these kids squealing and punching and chasing and diving into cardboard boxes, it's anarchy, it's mayhem, and a preschool teacher that's going to get the average parent comfortable will squelch that. And yet there is a normal spectrum of rough and tumble play that is important developmentally for these little kids, particularly 3 to 5-year-olds, to engage in, and it does some of the same things if one gets as objective as one can about what's happening in brain development. It does some of the same things for us it does for these lionesses. Rough and tumble play occurs worldwide, even in tough circumstances. This was taken at the height of the Iraq War. And it sequences itself into different patterns, of course: verbal jousting, kidding, gossiping. These become forms that are a bit more socially acceptable in rough and tumble play. And I know that I've got a couple of cousins that when I engage them after we've been away for a while, we spend at least a half an hour insulting each other before we get started with the more ritualized bonding processes. And one of the things that comes out of rough and tumble play that I think is very healthy is a sense of irony. the ability to step back if someone is teasing you, the ability to roll with the punches, the ability to handle and be much more adaptive emotionally. In the image that I showed you, the mother and infant with the attunement, when you follow emotional development from attunement on and observe it as it's related to play, often find that emotional regulation and the solidity of emotional regulation is greatly enhanced by play behavior. So it's not just fun, it's a lot more going on. People don't think of animals having games, but these are musk ox on Ellesmere Island. I was not up there, but the poor National Geographic photographer was. And you'll notice that these characters are putting their heads together, which is antithetical to their protective circling, because the main predators for musk ox are wolves, and they keep their horns out and keep their flanks safe. So something else is going on here, and the National Geographic photographer said they were playing a game of follow the leader. They had a conflab beforehand, and this is spectator and active play as seen in muskox land. Games are an important part of play. Ring Around the Rosie requires of little kids that they do a communal activity together. If you've ever seen Ashes, All Fall Down of a 3- and 4-year-old, it's an ordeal for the teacher, but they get it together, and games are part of the incentive to do that. And we keep needing kind of the stimulus of games often to keep us engaged as adults. Competition in sports are often a question that I'm asked a lot about in my studies of play, and there is a natural competition that occurs in play behavior in animals in the wild, and it occurs in humans as well. It need not be destructive and full of domination, but it is a slippery slope with a lot of Little League coaches and elsewhere, and parents who are highly ambitious that their kids become stars. These two characters look like they like each other, and love of the game and personal best and proficiency should be the mantras of the Little League and other coaches. Co-ed basketball, cooperative games. And this is a subject that I think we'll get into maybe in Q&A if people are interested in it. Video game, communal friendship via virtual friendships and the like. They certainly are playful, but there are some hazards associated with them. Coaching and ritualized play can certainly be a component of play. Storytelling, big part of play. Your internal narrative and storylines often define who we really are and what our value systems are. And this Bushman is obviously exaggerating the minnow he caught for this audience. Celebratory play. Spectators, Red Sox, at the moment, they won the World Series. And joyful spectator play, certainly a form of play and which we can all engage in. This is a picture of the Burning Man. Burning Man is a Nevada phenomenon, largely peopled by Californians. There were 48,000 on the Black Rock Desert last summer. A good friend of mine who's an artist goes year after year, finds it to be a Saturnalia where the rules are turned upside down, but he almost always comes back refreshed. It's ritual play, a very, very elaborate ritual play, not for everybody, but certainly exhibits that this is a form of play that's deeply entrenched in the human condition. Aesthetic play. The roots of a lot of aesthetics begin in the form and the beauty and the elegance and the symmetry that a lot of play behaviors produce. I can't say that every suffering poet who has come up with something great or a touching novelist was fostered by play, but perhaps for the reader and the observer it is. But aesthetics, the aesthetic aspect of living, particularly in adulthood, is an important adjunct to being a player. Well, I mentioned that I got involved in studying some murderers, so I'll give you a little personal background. Also will date me. This this picture was taken August 1st, 1966. And on that date, Charles Whitman went up to the Texas Tower after killing his wife and mother. He had been an Eagle Scout. He was an architectural engineering student, had been an NROT scholarship recipient, had been an altar boy, was a model student supposedly, and I was chosen along with some other people by the governor of Texas to try and determine why he shot and killed 14 people off the tower and wounded 41 after he'd killed his wife and mother. So we had a very elaborate and rich budget, brought in all the experts we could find, studied his life in great detail. And one of the major findings was that, and felt to be very significantly linked to his inability to handle his violent impulses, was that he had had progressive suppression of play behavior throughout his lifetime by a highly disturbed and violent father, who I subsequently examined, as I did his surviving two brothers. And so the fact that this committee, which was made up of hard scientists and social scientists and FBI and other people, had really come to the conclusion that this was a very significant aspect of linking his violent behavior to an absence of some experiential thing called play. I then got a grant and studied pilot study of a group of young murderers in the state of Texas who were alive and who we could match with controls and comparison group, and did extensive historical study of them and biological study of them. And we really thought at the start of that study that Whitman was an aberration because he was a mass murderer, he was intelligent, he came from an upper middle class background, and most of the young murderers in the state of Texas were across the spectrum, but they weren't like Whitman. However, we found that their play behavior and their play histories were very different and very aberrant as compared to the non-murder comparison group. So professionally, this is sort of what got my attention and led to the remainder of my clinical practice, which went on for another 25 years or so. I tried to evaluate play behavior in virtually everyone I saw, and because I was chief of service at a hospital service in a 50-bed inpatient mental hospital, I was able to acquire a fairly vast array of play histories, largely of people who were involved with psychiatric disorders. When I left that clinical activity as a practicing psychiatrist, I continued to be interested in play behavior, but not so much the aberrations of it, but what does it do when there's plenty of it? So 16 Nobel laureates later and some MacArthur Fellows and a group of high-performing individuals that I was able to interview with through a variety of other professional activities, I began to have this spectrum from Charles Whitman and the murderers through Nobel laureates and MacArthur Fellows, and play is over on this side. And the more play, it seemed the more successful, adaptable, resilient, vital with this group of people. So when I left clinical medicine and had some opportunities through some nonfiction film work that I'd done to get to know Jane Goodall and try and figure out a little more about the basics of play, I was able to go into Africa and spend a couple of years studying animal play. And it's that breadth of the evolution of animal play plus this the clinical manifestations of it that have continued to have me be very impassioned about it and bring me in front of you today, and that's why I wrote the book. But the Texas Tower got me started on that, and it was a very surprising and remarkable start. The findings have stood the test of time. So imagine a world, there are consequences in play deprivation. So imagine a world without play, and here are some of the outcomes. But think about no humor, no movies, no novels, no playing with a stuffed animal if you're a little kid, no hikes in the woods with your fantasies filled with whatever you want. Begin to strip play out of your life, and the opposite of play is now work. The opposite of play is depression. And one of the things that I want to get across is that play and work do not need to be separate. There are ways for most of us, regardless of the demands of our jobs, to bring play and play states into our hourly and daily life. What are some of the languages of play? Play has its languages, which I think a lot of times we lose as adults. I don't think anybody in the audience has any question what's going to follow from this kind of signaling from a dog. You know you're going to play with that dog. The dog's not going to bite you. You're not going to have any problem. That's an icon of trust. And play uses different languages. Zebras have never been domesticated, I understand, because they bite and hold and kill you with their bite. So no cowboy ever rode a zebra because it wouldn't have worked. But when they're playing with each other, the same mechanism becomes an agent of play. So there is a central nervous system process. It shifts from carnivores, such as we showed in the lions and the polar bear, to zebras, where play operates and organizes things in a different way. And it is that different organization that probably gives us and our own brains the capacity to make new connections and to find a way to be more adaptable than we would without it. Chasing is a fundamental part of play. It's a signal. I think of a series of movies where there's always a chase scene, which grabs me anyhow, virtually every time there is one. It's a fundamental part of play. This is cross-species play, which we saw with the polar bear and husky. Another one where the signals are play can be seen to cross species lines and are universal worldwide. Here's another asymmetry of power with play signals. That's not a play signal. So we get the differences between all the signals and play. Now, I love talking about rats, and this may not be the best audience for me to talk about rats, but I love to talk about them because they have a very particular way of playing. From about 4 weeks to 15 weeks old, a rat will give a squeak, it's subsonic, that says, I want to play. Another rat will hear the squeak, and they'll rise up and begin a wrestling match. And they'll mutually pin each other. One will pin, then the other one will pin, and they'll nuzzle each other's neck, and they'll engage in a very specific series of play behaviors. And there have been some investigators who have decided they really want to study this behavior. So Sergio Pellis, who's an investigator from Canada, has been 30 years studying rat play. He's a marvelous expert in brain imaging and brain chemistry, and he has found that rough and tumble play in rats does a lot of very good things for rat brains. It increases brain size, increases the connections, increases the deposition of a substance called brain-derived neurotrophic factor in the executive portion of the rat brain, small as it may be, it's still the executive portion. And rats who rough and tumble play well, mate well, have better immune systems, live longer, and when they stop this behavior, when they selectively suppress rough and tumble play in rats, guess what happens? They become Charles Whitmans. They can't tell friend from foe, they can't handle violence and aggression, they don't mate, they can survive in terms of their foraging and food, but they don't survive socially. And that social competency that is a part of all social mammals appears to require a minimum amount of play in order for us to be competent social adults. So I'm not going to spend a whole lot of more time on the brain. I'd like to, but I've noticed that my audiences tend to glaze when I do this, so you're doing pretty well, I think, so I'll move on. But we're getting more and more really wonderful influx from the technology that now has allowed us to see more what's going on in real time in brain function, and the correlations of that with the animal studies and animal play studies really are allowing, I think, play science to begin to take its place at the university table. How do I know we're designed for play? Well, let's take a look at that. We go back to this initial picture of attunement. I want you to notice that the cranial shape of the baby and the cranial shape of the mother are not highly different. There is a vast difference between being an adult and an infant, obviously, but the shape of the head of the mother human primate and the infant human primate are nothing like the differences that one sees in chimpanzee infants and chimpanzee adults. And what I'm going to head toward is, by showing this external physiognomy, these external signs, there are also internal nervous system design features that are a part of some of these same differences, even though 98.5% of our genetic load is carried by the chimpanzee. We're kinship in terms of our genes, not necessarily the timing of them, but in the actual genetics itself. Here is a Labrador puppy. Why would I put a Labrador puppy in a talk about play? Well, everybody knows puppies are playful, and everybody knows Labradors are playful. But if you look at this Labrador puppy, it's got a short muzzle, ears that are floppy, and very playful behavior. And if you look at a wolf puppy, they're really pretty similar, and their behavior is pretty similar. The wolf puppy will, at a certain point, play constantly and retrieve, which is what the Labrador puppy does. The only difference is the Labrador puppy grows up to be an adult Labrador and still plays and retrieves, whereas the wolf developed into something else. It developed into a hierarchical, very specific type of pack behavior that's associated with a wolf adulthood, and the muzzle elongates and the ears are upright and they have very different behaviors. Yes, they're still playful, but they're not anywhere near as playful as an adult lab. That's a 14-year-old lab. And if you walked up to that lab would be very, very likely to play. And if any of you have Goldens or dogs that have been bred for play, you know they're players. Well, if you look at the history of human primatology, I would say we are the Labradors of the primates. We sustain immaturity into adulthood, and our nervous systems are more flexible. We grow new neurons. We can recover from strokes much better than a chimpanzee that would have the same area of damage. And a lot of this is because we retain immature features throughout our lives. And what are the hallmarks of some of these immature, in quote, even though we die of old age, we're immature biologically. And that means that part of the hallmark of being immature is to retain play behavior. 6,000 play histories. It's toxic when you don't play. You're not a good parent. You're not a very good boss. You're not usually very happy. It's not the way we're designed. So although we're not all Einsteins, I think most of us know individuals who have retained a brightness and a flexibility throughout their lives. And I would say that that's a major contribution of play behavior and one of the reasons it's necessary. Now, if you've lost play and you're working 80-hour weeks here and you think it's not for you, how do you get it? Read the book. Go back into your own play history. Find a moment or two moments where you were absolutely at bliss, where the world was right, where you had either a favorite bicycle, as I think of Christmas getting my first Schwinn, which was a 24-inch Schwinn, and I mean, that was a moment of bliss. And I think find those moments and then say, okay, I experienced that. That was me. That was pure play. Or if you've got a kid, learn from the kid by watching them play, because their play is pure. Bring it into your contemporary life some way so that the state of play becomes a part of who you are virtually every hour and every day. And your life will be better. Microsoft will make more money. We may even Congress may become, less bipartisan. I think there are definite payoffs. I'm going a little over the top, but that's me. Play is also transformative in a moral and ethical way. And I think this exemplifies a bit of that.
For Bo and White, the most profound moments of the trip came from a visit to an orphanage nursery. Here, 40 infants were lying two to a bed, including 6-month-old Cara.
It's a gift to me. It's a gift to myself to be here with Karn. I mean, I'm selfish. Selfish enough to own what I need. And I need this kind of connection. And you don't have to come to San Salvador to do this.
Patch Adams has come to realize that, at the heart of the matter, there is play and love. They both connect us at the deepest level.
We are taking play in our clowning in a much more traditional sense of play. Loud noise, gay abandon, laughing frivolity. But it's incorrect to think that play doesn't have a silent component. Take the child that was in the hospital today. I didn't ask what her problem was, but play made it possible for me to go up and be with her. And there was her father and her. For me, that's play. I am using play to go to the worst possible moment. Play is a connector. Play and love address alienation like a frontal attack.
I don't have to come here to be fully alive. But when you're around people that are suffering, one of the things suffering does, it evokes something in you. You get your heart broken open and then you see what's inside. I think if we started valuing play more, then what we would probably do would be, we'd be paying attention in new ways with beginner's mind, with the eyes of the child, and see options and possibilities to solve some of the enormous problems that we have. I don't think play is done to the exclusion of ignoring the pain and suffering and unfairness of the world. I think play may help us better deal with it, actually.
That's a self-portrait. Thank you very much. Yes.
My daughter, who's a teenager, she loves to ride horses and play with animals and horses and things. And I'm just wondering, as a parent, what should how should I try to engage my older children in play? What's good, healthy play for teenagers as they get older?
Depends on the teenager. Did everybody hear the question? Part of the reason to take a play history is to go back and recognize your own temperament, your own natural temperament as a player. And your kids generally will tell you what, if they have an enriched environment. Let's say you've got a daughter, you've allowed her to have access to horses, and she's attached to those horses and enjoying them, and that's a good part of her play, I assume. It's not, she's not, bugging out of school and ending up at the racetrack or something. But the temperament of the child will usually give the parent signals as to what directions to go to enrich them. You don't want to make a soccer star out of somebody who would rather be quietly listening to music and maybe composing their own songs, which would be their play nature. And the temperament and play nature, and the book talks about play personalities being the explorer and the collector and the kinesthete and. And I think finding those things and letting your own kids teach you is part of the way to go. I mean, culturally, we've got boundaries that tell us, they've got to use every moment well, and they've got to get good grades, and they've got to do this, and they've got to do that. Well, to me, I think the legal contracts we now have with the schools are not necessarily educational. And legally contractual, no child left behind, or test scores really impair, as much as I love to see deprived kids be able to read, they impair access often to playfulness on the part of the teacher and to playful learning on the part of the kid. So if your kid can be, kids, you have how many kids?
I have 5.
5 kids. Wow. How old?
How old are they?
Yeah,
14 down to 18 months.
Well, your 18-month-old will probably teach all of you what the purity of play is. And if that 18-month-old looks out at objects and loves to look at a mobile, for example, then chances are that look at the artistic side of that kid and foster it. If all the kid wants to do is look you in the face and smile and goo and coo, they're going to be a socializing kind of kid, and that's probably going to be their talent. And the thing that these 6,000 histories have taught me, and I wish that I'd known this earlier in my life when I was helping to raise my own kids, is that the access to talent and empowerment comes through play behavior, particularly early. And that doesn't stop when we get to be adults. We can still tap into our own empowerment as adults by finding what it is we really like to do. Damned hard to do it in a contemporary culture, but it can be done. Hope that answers your question. Yeah.
You alluded twice during your talk to maybe considering some modern, what I think a lot of us would consider play involving computers. You seem to sort of treat it as maybe only marginally played. Could you say a little bit more about that or elaborate?
Yeah, I'm the last guy that should be an expert on this, being in my 70s and somewhat, shall we say, compromised in my technical expertise, and of that generation. This answer has to be filtered through that screen. But I think internet play, for example, and jokes, and the sharing of a lot of those kinds of jocular fun things constitute a pretty important part of cultural play right now that seems to be universally enjoyed. And so the problem I have with prolonged screen activity is as I sit here and look at this screen and see this play, if I'm hooked up to brain imaging, my cerebellum is dead. And what we know now about the cerebellum is that you used to think all it did was help you move through time and space and coordinate your eyes and that sort of thing. What we now know is that three-dimensional movement fires up the executive cortex. So that prolonged screen activity in the absence of gravitational force or three-dimensional involvement or multisensory involvement, I think tends to be a somewhat constricting experience. Now, video games, they're fun. Kids love them. Adults love them. But when they become a driven way of life, where getting out of the compulsion is tough, I think they've become, then you've got an addictive component combined with play, and the addictive component is damaging. I don't see the play component as being damaging. I don't know if that gets to the heart of your question or not. Yes?
You've mentioned a few times the phrase pure play, and I noticed as well a lot of the slides of what you've shown are children at play or very young animals at play, and so there's kind of like this purity to their play that I understand. Maybe you can help define exactly what you mean by that, and as well, how would you translate pure play into an adult lifestyle, for instance, where play, I think, as we get older, can lead to more and more. I have friends that play by going out clubbing, just may or may not be a very healthy. I have another friend as well that was raised, I think, his family really put a high premium on having a good time and having fun and really seeking pleasure. And now he has a lot of drug problems and issues where play has become a little bit more self-destructive, in the idea that play can be, play is not goal-oriented. It's about having pleasure outside of the realm of responsibility. And I don't know if that, as an adult, is necessarily a healthy thing, or maybe you would define.
Well, I would define it somewhat differently. Part of the reason I did all the developmental sequencing is that if you have play that goes through attachment, rough and tumble, imaginative, games, narrative, and you get most of those sequences into your being, you'll increase perseverance, you'll increase the desire for mastery, and those are not hedonistic, escapist kinds of activities. I think there can be a difference between being so overwhelmed you've got to have an escape, and the escape is not necessarily a state of play, it's escape, but it's a different state than the sled dog and the polar bear. So that, yes, there are people who are strictly narcissists who only want their own pleasure are not going to be very good citizens. And the struggle sometimes to find a balance between those, between being highly narcissistic and escapist and having enough pleasure to cope well, is not always an easy trail to follow. But if you can think about what, for an adult, it's hard to show imaginative play on the screen. I mean, maybe a good director could do it, but I didn't today. But there are lots of adult kinds of play that are true play that don't necessarily involve physical activity or games, but can be entirely mental. I think, I can think of reading a novel that for me, in the midst of the novel, I'm lost. I'm involved in a different state. I'm with the characters. I'm fantasizing more about the characters. That to me is as valid as some of the hiking and biking and tennis that I like to do. Yes?
I think the previous question actually brought up an
Sure.
interesting question for me. Do you consider pleasure to be the goal of play, or pleasure to simply be the side effect of play? Because I kind of gathered from your presentation that there's plenty of other goals of play, such as exploration and so on.
Yeah, I think the answer is, if in the process of playing, the process itself seems to be more important than the outcome, that constitutes play behavior, and that may not always be pleasure. I think you can be practicing an instrument and kind of imagining being able to master the chords or being able to play a recital or do something of that sort, which constitutes a form of play behavior, but isn't in itself at that moment entirely pleasure-based. So the definition of play is really tough to be as precise as I'd like to be, largely because play evolutionarily got established well before language. It is pre-verbal, and you see it in the animals. We all can see, if I had a Labrador in here running around, licking and rolling and chasing a ball, we'd all know that was play, because you can sense it without words. So to define the pleasure component, and I sometimes get lost in too much academic definition of the play itself. Yes?
I have a couple, 3 questions that popped into my head while you were talking. I noticed in the rough and tumble play as socialization, most of the images you were showing were children, siblings, child groups. So my question is, sometimes adult, parents will play with their children kind of rough and tumble, sometimes they don't. Especially, I think, as our society gets busier and busier and busier, people are working 80-hour weeks and so forth.
Right.
So, and also our society, at least in America, and certainly China's policy is more and more people are having just one child. How do you think that this would affect society as a whole? Because it seems to me like rough and tumble play would kind of go by the wayside in one-child families with extremely busy parents.
I think it could go, rough and tumble play can go by the by, but I think if you listen to the kid and your own viscera, you'll still engage in rough and tumble play, parent-child play, and the kid will foster it. Because it's part of the reason to talk about rough and tumble plays is that it comes out of the natural forces within the kid. And it often takes, if you see it, like I've seen it in chimpanzees in the wild, for example, the subadult chimpanzee will be sitting there sort of eating, and the kid will come up and, and pound on them, and finally they'll get involved in play. So the signaling often comes from the kid. You need to have the openness to respond to it if there's not another child around for rough and tumble play. But I haven't been to China, so I don't know if they've got preschools and whether these single kids get together much. But you put kids together, and they do it on their own. And one of the tragedies, I think, in our culture is that a lot of kids suddenly go into a group setting where they have not had the parallel play and the beginning play, and they'll either be bullies or they won't have the signaling systems to enter into that play scene. And that's where a really good parent or a wise preschool teacher or playground supervisor can bring those kids into normal play behavior. Terribly important, because if they miss it, I think they're missing a big portion of their life. Yes?
Does your study have any specifics or recommendations that you can let us know that, say for example, when I ask my kids to learn, because learning and play will have to be together, right? What kind of sequencing usually will be better? Say, play 1 hour piano better, or play 2 half-an-hour piano with some plays in between will be better? Do you study this kind of patterns?
I wish I had answers to that. I think a lot of it depends, again, on the arousal, age, situation of the kid, whether they're finding it, having enough fun so that the mastery of the piano gives them enough pleasure so that it's not just the parent demanding or the music teacher demanding a certain level of mastery. I can't say that I particularly, I won't call on my son because I can't say that I handled all this particularly well while I was a parent. How about it, Barry? He's taking the fifth, I think. Yes.
Sometimes the young parents are so busy, so they leave their baby or young kids just watch some education TV. So do you consider that kind of play? And do you think it's positive or negative effects on the baby?
Well, the American Academy of Pediatrics has been pretty explicit about television under the age of 2, that it is not considered to be very healthy for brain development. And I read, I don't know where it was this week, I read a letter to the editor somewhere that where a young father was saying he was exhausted and involved in childcare and he just wanted to hold his kid and watch TV. Was that okay? And the pediatrician answered and said, well, better to hold him than to just let him sit there and watch TV. But I'm kind of anti-TV for kids all the way through until they're well along into elementary school. I watch a couple of my grandchildren who have very limited access to television, but I was playing on the floor with, I have a daughter that lives in Boulder, and I was playing on the floor with her 2 kids, and husband came in. We were in the family room and turned on the TV very quietly, and we were really actively engaged in play. As soon as the TV went on, they had this lock on to the TV. And I mean, the play, the stuff they were doing was sort of irrelevant, and they were just stuck on the imagery. So the visual imagery of TV, any visual image, is very powerful and very, very alerting. And one of the advisors to the National Institute for Play says that we're a cephalocentric, visually overwhelmed culture, and that we don't do enough touching and smelling and that sort of thing. So I'm probably more anti-TV than a lot. Yes.
What kind of play we should discourage for kids? Is there any kind of play we should not take?
I'm sorry. What kind of?
We should discourage for kids. Is there any
discourage?
Discourage. I would discourage bullying, domination, sadistic, cruel. I mean, kids can do that. I mean, kids can be very cruel. And this is where supervision, just as I showed that kid on the long ramp, when you see antisocial behavior developing, it needs to be stopped. It needs to be dealt with. That's what parents are for. What I don't like to see is no free play that's entirely generated from within the kid. And if everything is sort of organized in adult scheduling, play dates, soccer, ballet, music lessons, and there's no open time, I think that's very, very tough on a kid. In the back.
The question on structured versus unstructured play. I think there is play like sports, there's play like puzzles and so on and so forth. probably in the developed countries. The poorer kids typically tend to play on the street, play with marbles, horses, sticks, whatnot.
I'm a little hard of hearing, so if you
I'll repeat that. Tell me if you can't hear, just raise your hand.
Say again?
This is about structured and unstructured play.
Okay.
And, there is structured play that we're all used to, puzzles, sports, and whatnot.
Sure.
One of the things about happiness factor that they've seen in many countries is many of the poorer countries, the kids are happier because most of their play is unstructured. And it's sort of like the animals that you're talking about in your pictures. They just get together, they make faces, and they do things, and there's crying, booing, and all those things, but it's more of adapting, and then they come back the next day. They don't go and complain to their daddies and mommies because there's nobody around. So, going back to your hiring by some of these places about those who tinker around, I'm wondering whether we should have a lot more of that spontaneity because I keep telling my children to go wild. They think I'm crazy.
Good.
So, and I laugh, do crazy things with them. In fact, yesterday, Kevin Turner, who's our chief operating officer, was in a meeting. There's something called PRISM going on. And Dr. Kobe was there. And there, he asked everybody to say, "Ee-haw." And so we were in an adjacent room watching television, and then some of us said, "Ee-haw." Not too many people said that.
Yeah.
Right? But we were in an adjacent room, mind you, because all the others in the other room said that. I'm wondering whether that kind of behavior is something you would encourage, to go wild, to do crazy things. From a brain perspective is what I'm asking, as opposed to some emotional perspective.
Well, I've done it, and Frank Forensic in the back is an expert at getting audiences going with playful stuff. I've gone to a large company that will remain unnamed and had a problem-solving session done just sort of like we're sitting here and we present the problem and they solve it. And then I've had them get on wobble boards and attempt to juggle and manipulate some other objects and then give them a comparable problem and look at the outcome. And the outcome of the second, after they've been in a state of play, the outcome of the second problem solving is way better than the initial one. So, unstructured play, what you say about kids who do not have the affluence and, let's say, pre-programmed toys and the kinds of things that are available to a lot of our kids do tend to have much more creative play that emerges from within themselves. And I'm not enough an anthropologist to know whether they're happier or not. Yes?
So I have a toddler who is very shy, and you talked about playing against gravity or being rough and tough, and she is like all against, like not at all that. I don't know whether she's just being lazy or she's like that. So my question is there any long-term negative effect of this, like brain development or something, which she might face like 20 years down the line?
Well, she may not be recruited to be on the women's pro basketball circuit, but did she crawl much as an infant?
No, not really. And we gave it on the carpeting floor of America. It's not a hard floor, so they cannot.
Well, I would say try and find rhythmic or physical activity, things that she will enjoy, and foster them, because physical movement, three-dimensional movement, physical movement, limb movement, development of one's body is an important aspect, just as you would take a terribly shy child and help them socialize. Even if their nature is going to be introverted and not particularly social, they're still going to have to live in a world where that's the expectation. So I think part of what parenting does is make up for some of the things that may not come entirely naturally to them. But I'll bet you can find something that she enjoys that will light her up, that does involve some movement. And because I'd be very surprised, because most kids like to move even if they're not necessarily highly coordinated by nature. One more.
Can you talk about your thoughts on our educational system and how it does or doesn't nurture the kind of creativity that comes from a playful environment?
The educational system is so pluralistic, it's hard to answer it in a single way, but I think the the direct contact I've had with school boards and with California education as it is now in a variety of socioeconomic settings, the teachers are under tremendous pressure. Recess is being diminished. Teaching to the test, it puts a lot of pressure on the teacher, and yet the outcomes that we know about education and know very objectively are that if the teacher is enthusiastic and playful in the subject that they're teaching, regardless of whether it's Waldorf, Montessori, or No Child Left Behind, there's going to be a better outcome. We also know that long-term academic performance is improved by long recess. That data is in. So, you know, there are really some dedicated, wonderful educational environments, and there's a lot of grassroots things that are happening that I think are play-based and very important. But I'm hoping to have lunch with Michelle Obama one of these days.